Have you ever noticed something strange? The people who are always there are often the easiest to overlook. But the person who suddenly disappears can become impossible to forget. And that's where the mystery begins. Why can someone spend months trying to earn attention and barely be noticed, while another person quietly walks away and suddenly occupies your thoughts? Why do some absences feel heavier than a presence ever did? The answer has nothing to do with romance, nothing to do with emotional games, and everything to do with human nature. Because people rarely stop to appreciate what is always available. They assume it will always be there. Until one day, it isn't. And sometimes, the moment you stop chasing, stop explaining, stop proving your worth, is the exact moment people begin to see what they were overlooking all along. Not because you manipulated them. Not because you played a game. But because absence reveals what presence often hides. Tonight, we're exploring one of the most misunderstood forms of power. The power of disappearing. Why silence unsettles people. Why unfinished stories linger in the mind. And why the people who leave the deepest mark are often the ones who no longer need attention at all. Why we stop seeing what is always there. There is a contradiction at the heart of human nature. The more available something becomes, the less attention we pay to it. Think about electricity. Most days, you never notice it. You turn on a light. Charge your phone. Make your coffee. Everything works exactly as expected. And because it is always there, it becomes invisible. Until the day it isn't. Then suddenly, it becomes the only thing you can think about. Human relationships often follow the same pattern. Not because people are selfish. Not because they are cruel. But because familiarity quietly changes perception. The mind is designed to filter out what feels predictable. The ticking clock fades into the background. The road you drive every day becomes automatic. The things that never change stop demanding attention. And unfortunately, people can become invisible in exactly the same way. This is why so many people make a costly mistake. They believe value comes from being constantly available. Always responding. Always reassuring. Always there. At first, this feels like loyalty. Like commitment. Like love. But over time, something subtle begins to happen. Their presence becomes expected. And expectations are dangerous. Because expectations disguise value. What was once appreciated becomes assumed. What was once noticed becomes normal. And what becomes normal often becomes invisible. Think of a lighthouse standing on a dark cliff. Night after night, its light cuts through the fog, guiding ships safely to the harbor. The sailors look at the shore. But they don't look at the light. They take its steady pulse for granted. Because it has always been there. But the moment that light goes dark, the ocean suddenly feels vast, terrifying, and empty. Only in the sudden darkness do they realize that the lighthouse was the only thing keeping them safe. Perhaps that is one of the most painful truths in life. People often recognize value only after they are forced to experience its absence. The Stoics understood this long before modern psychology existed. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself that everything in life is temporary. Not to create fear, but to create awareness. Because awareness creates appreciation. The moment we assume something will always be there, we stop seeing it clearly. Including people. The truth is, Most people do not intentionally overlook others. They simply become accustomed to their presence. Day after day. Week after week. Until one day, the pattern changes. The familiar voice goes silent. The message never arrives. The person who was always there, isn't. And that is when something fascinating begins to happen. The mind notices that a familiar pattern has been broken. And once it notices, it cannot unnotice it. The moment the pattern breaks, the mind notices that a familiar pattern has been broken. And once it notices, it cannot unnotice it. This is where everything begins. Not when someone leaves. Not when they stop talking. Not when they disappear. The real shift happens later. The moment the mind realizes something unexpected. The pattern is not returning. Because human beings rarely react to absence itself. They react to change. To disruption. To something happening differently than expected. Think about your daily routine. Imagine driving the same route to work, every morning, for years. The same turns. The same traffic lights. The same familiar landmarks. Most days, you barely think about any of it. Then one morning, the road is suddenly closed. Immediately, your attention sharpens. You become alert. Focused. Curious. Not because the road was extraordinary, but because the pattern was broken. The human brain is constantly predicting what comes next. Much of what we call comfort comes from predictability. We like knowing what tomorrow will look like. We like knowing who will be there. Predictability creates certainty. And certainty creates comfort. But the moment certainty disappears, the mind begins searching. Searching for explanations. Searching for meaning. Searching for answers. This is exactly what happens when a familiar presence suddenly vanishes. At first, the reaction is subtle. Almost invisible. A passing thought. A brief pause. A small interruption in the normal rhythm of life. Maybe someone notices a message never arrived. Maybe they glance at their phone, expecting a notification. Maybe they instinctively think about reaching out. Then they remember. Something is different. Think of an old pendulum clock, standing in a quiet room. Day after day, it ticks. A steady, predictable rhythm. Tick. Tock. Tick. Tock. For months, you never truly hear it. It blends completely into the background of your life. It becomes invisible, because it is always there. But if that clock suddenly stops, in the middle of the night, the sudden silence will wake you up. Your eyes open. Your heart rate quickens. You look into the darkness, suddenly alert. You didn't wake up because of a loud noise. You woke up because a predictable rhythm was broken. That is the paradox of absence. Sometimes people do not miss what was there. They notice what is no longer there. And that distinction matters. Because before people feel regret, before they feel loss, before they feel longing, they experience something else. Something quieter. Something more powerful. Curiosity. The mind begins asking questions. What happened? Why did they leave? Was there something I missed? Did I misunderstand them? And once those questions appear, a new chapter begins. Because the human mind has a fundamental weakness. It struggles to let go of unanswered questions. And that weakness is about to become the most important part of our story. Why unfinished stories stay in the mind. The human mind struggles to let go of unanswered questions. And perhaps, you've experienced this yourself. Think about the last movie that truly stayed with you. Was it the one that explained everything, answered every question, wrapped up every loose end? Probably not. More often, the stories that stay with us are the unfinished ones. The ones that leave something unresolved. The ones that make us sit quietly after the credits roll. Still thinking. Still wondering. Still searching. Why? Because the human mind craves closure. It wants the missing piece. The final chapter. The answer to the question. And when it doesn't get one, it keeps looking. Even when we don't realize it. In psychology, this is known as the Zeigarnik Effect. Studies show that the human brain remembers uncompleted or interrupted tasks far better than tasks that have been finished. When a story is left incomplete, the brain refuses to file it away. It keeps the file open on your mental desktop, burning energy, constantly trying to solve the puzzle. Neither do our emotions. This is why certain conversations stay with us. Certain memories. Certain people. Not necessarily because they were the most important, but because they never felt complete. Imagine walking through an art gallery and standing before a massive, beautiful canvas. The artist spent months painting it. But right in the center, they left a blank, unpainted circle. You could look at the brilliant colors, the intricate details, for hours. But your eyes will always return to that empty space. Long after you leave the gallery, you won't remember the colors that were there. You will remember the space that was empty. People can become unfinished stories too. And unfinished stories are powerful. Because the imagination takes over where reality stops. The moment certainty disappears, possibilities rush in. Maybe they were hurt. Maybe they changed. Maybe I misunderstood them. Maybe there was something I failed to see. Maybe there was more to the story than I realized. Notice what happens. The mind is no longer thinking about facts. It is thinking about possibilities. And possibilities can be surprisingly addictive. A fact closes a door. A possibility leaves it open. That is why uncertainty often lingers longer than certainty. A painful truth may hurt, but eventually, it settles. An unanswered question is different. It keeps moving, keeps growing, keeps asking for attention. Have you ever replayed a conversation, years after it happened? Have you ever wondered what someone really meant? Have you ever imagined a different ending? Why do certain memories refuse to disappear, while others fade away completely? Perhaps because they never truly ended. Perhaps because part of you is still looking for closure. This is why absence can become so powerful, not because silence says more than words, but because silence leaves room for interpretation, and interpretation keeps the story alive. The mind begins connecting dots, revisiting memories, re-examining moments that once seemed ordinary. A joke, a glance, a conversation, a goodbye that didn't feel important at the time. Suddenly those moments appear different. Not because the past changed, but because attention changed. And the more attention something receives, the more significant it begins to feel. Slowly, almost without noticing, curiosity becomes emotional investment. The story that seemed complete begins feeling unfinished. And the unfinished story begins demanding an answer. But eventually, the search for answers takes an unexpected turn. Because sooner or later, the hardest questions are no longer about the other person. They become questions about ourselves. And that is the moment silence stops feeling empty. It becomes a mirror. When silence becomes a mirror, the hardest questions are no longer about the other person. They become questions about ourselves. And that is the moment silence becomes a mirror. At first, silence feels empty. A missing message. A missing voice. A missing presence. But if silence lasts long enough, something unexpected begins to happen. The focus shifts. The search changes direction. Because eventually, there are only so many times the mind can ask, where did they go? Before it is forced to ask, what did I fail to see? Most people spend their lives surrounded by noise. Conversations. Responsibilities. Notifications. Entertainment. There is always something demanding attention. Something to react to. Something to use as an escape. But silence removes the escape routes. And when distractions disappear, awareness arrives. Not all at once. Slowly. Quietly. Like sunlight entering a forgotten room. Imagine standing beside a mountain lake on a stormy day. The surface is restless. Constant movement. Constant distortion. You cannot see beneath it. But when the wind finally stops, the water becomes perfectly still. And suddenly, everything hidden in the depths becomes visible. The human mind works much the same way. When life is loud, we rarely see ourselves clearly. But when life becomes quiet, reflection becomes unavoidable. And reflection is rarely comfortable. Because it asks questions that noise allows us to ignore. Did I truly appreciate them? Did I listen when they were trying to tell me something through their silence? Did I assume there would always be another opportunity? Did I mistake consistency for permanence? These questions matter because they reveal a profound psychological flaw. Most people do not lose appreciation because they are cruel. They lose appreciation because certainty creates blindness. When something feels permanent, we stop noticing it. When something feels guaranteed, we stop valuing it. When someone is always there, we assume they always will be. Until one day, they aren't. History tells us that the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, despite ruling the Western world, would often retreat into the deepest, quietest chambers of his palace at midnight. Surrounded by absolute silence. Stripped of his crown. Stripped of his title. He would look into his own soul. He wrote that only when the noise of the empire died down, could he see what truly mattered. And what he had taken for granted, during the chaotic hours of the day. He understood that power could command armies. But only silence could command truth. Perhaps that is how life teaches us its heaviest lessons. We discover the value of a presence only after time removes the opportunity to experience it. The Stoics understood this deeply. Everything in life is borrowed. Not owned. Borrowed. Every relationship. Every friendship. Every ordinary moment. Because when we remember that something is temporary, we begin seeing it clearly. We become more present. More grateful. More awake. And that is the hidden gift of silence. Not that it makes us miss someone, but that it forces us to see what was overlooked, what was taken for granted. But seeing clearly comes with a cost. The moment we finally understand what we failed to appreciate, another emotion quietly enters the room. Regret. Why regret arrives too late. The moment we finally understand what we failed to appreciate, regret enters the room. And regret is one of the strangest emotions we experience. Because unlike loss, it rarely arrives immediately. Loss happens in a sudden moment. Regret unfolds slowly over time. At first, when someone leaves our lives, we focus on what is missing. The empty chair, the silent phone, the familiar presence that is gone. But regret asks a completely different question. Loss asks, what did you lose? Regret asks, what did you fail to see? And that question is much harder to answer. There is a reason so many people look back on certain chapters of their lives and whisper the same four words. I didn't realize. I didn't realize how much they cared. I didn't realize how much they quietly carried. I didn't realize how important they were. I didn't realize it was the last time. And perhaps those four words have broken more hearts than almost any other sentence in human history. Because hidden inside them is a painful truth. The opportunity existed. The value existed. The moment existed. But your awareness did not. In ancient Greece, thinkers divided time into two concepts. Chronos, the linear ticking of the clock, and kairos, the weight of the perfect, meaningful moment. We often live our lives entirely in chronos. Counting days, chasing goals, assuming the clock will simply keep ticking. We treat ordinary days as replaceable. We look at the person sitting across from us and assume there will be another conversation, another visit, another tomorrow. But life does not bargain with assumptions. While we are busy looking ahead at the next destination, the beautiful, quiet reality of the present passes through our hands. One ordinary moment at a time. The Stoics warned us about this. Not because they feared loss, but because they feared unconscious living. The moment we assume something will always be there, we stop paying attention. And attention is where appreciation begins. Without attention, gratitude fades. Without gratitude, value becomes invisible. And when value becomes invisible, regret becomes inevitable. This is why regret often feels heavier than loss. Loss accepts reality. Regret argues with it. Loss says, it is gone. Regret says, it didn't have to be. Loss hurts. But regret haunts. Because regret keeps attempting to rewrite the past. Imagining different choices. Different words. Different actions. Different endings. And that is why certain memories stay with us for decades. Not because they were the biggest milestones of our lives, but because they were the moments we failed to fully experience while they were happening. The message we never replied to. The appreciation we postponed. The relationship we assumed would survive our neglect. The person we expected to always be there, until they weren't. And suddenly, the lesson becomes absolute. Distance does not create value. Distance reveals value. The value was always there, we were simply too blind to see it. And once that realization settles into the heart, the story changes forever. When regret begins to search, regret was never meant to remain still. Sooner or later, it begins searching. Searching for relief. Searching for understanding. Searching for a way to make sense of what was lost. Because there comes a point when simply remembering is no longer enough. The mind wants answers. The heart wants meaning. And both begin looking for something that might ease the weight they carry. At first, the search seems predictable. People revisit old memories, old conversations, old photographs, moments they once overlooked, moments that now feel strangely magnetic. But over time, something unexpected happens. The search becomes less about the other person, and more about the hidden truth inside the experience. Think of an ancient stone statue, standing in the center of a bustling city courtyard. For decades, thousands of people walk past it every single day. It provides shade on hot afternoons. It offers shelter from sudden rain. Yet because it is always there, it blends into the background. Nobody looks at its face. Nobody appreciates its silent architecture, but one morning, the city removes the statue, leaving nothing behind, except an empty stone perimeter. Suddenly, people stop. They look at the empty space, feeling a strange sense of displacement. Only when the statue is gone, do they realize how much its silent presence anchored their daily journey. Sometimes we only discover the true weight of a presence when the space it occupied becomes an empty void. Once people become aware of that emptiness, they begin searching. Not because they enjoy uncertainty, but because uncertainty creates tension. And the human mind demands resolution. But eventually, the search changes. People stop asking, where did they go, and they are forced to ask, what was life trying to show me? That question changes everything. Because every absence contains a lesson. Every ending contains insight. Some people spend years searching for what they lost, trying to rebuild a past that no longer exists. Others begin searching for the wisdom the loss was trying to teach them. And those two paths lead to entirely different destinations. One keeps you trapped in the ashes of yesterday. The other slowly guides you into tomorrow. The most important question is never, how do I get them back? The ultimate question is, who am I becoming because they left? The moment you ask that question, pain begins transforming into perspective. Regret transforms into understanding. And understanding creates something unexpected. Space. Space where constant longing once lived. Space where endless questions once echoed. Space where something new can finally begin to breathe. Without realizing it, your attention shifts away from what left, toward what remains. Away from who walked away, toward who you are becoming. The greatest power is no longer needing to be chosen. As your attention slowly moves inward, clarity begins to dawn. Not the kind that arrives in a lightning bolt of drama, but the quieter kind. The kind that only arrives after enough silence. At some point, a final realization emerges. The real story was never about the person who walked away. It was always about the person who remained. You. For so long, your energy was projected outward. What they thought, what they felt, what they wanted, whether they would stay, whether they would return, whether they would ever look back and finally see your worth. But eventually, a colder, sharper truth appears. What about your own life? What about your own peace? What about the fortress of your own mind? Every experience of absence eventually leads to a crossroads. One path keeps begging for outside validation. The other begins building inner sovereignty. The Stoics believed that true freedom, what they called ataraxia, begins the exact moment your peace no longer depends on things outside your control. Not because you become cold. Not because you become unfeeling. But because you refuse to surrender your inner world to the unpredictable whims of others. People will enter your life. People will leave. Some will appreciate your depth. Some will be blinded by it. Some will understand your value. Others never will. The question is, can you remain steady anyway? Can you remain whole anyway? Can you continue moving forward anyway? That is where real power begins. Not in being chosen. Not in being admired. Not in being missed. But in knowing exactly who you are, even when you are forgotten by the world. What if freedom was never found in being chosen by someone else? What if it was found in no longer needing to be, because the moment you stop anchoring your worth to another person's approval, something remarkable happens. You stop chasing. You stop forcing. You stop negotiating your value. And for the first time, you begin to stand. Not because life became easier, but because you became unshakable. And perhaps that is the greatest miracle, hidden inside absence. It is not that someone finally notices your value. It is that you finally stop forgetting it. And once that happens, you no longer fear being left behind. Because you are no longer leaving yourself behind. The truth about disappearing. So, what is the real power of disappearing? It is not a psychological game to make someone miss you. It is not a manipulation tactic to make someone chase you. And it is certainly not about controlling another person's emotions. The real power of disappearing is that it allows the dust to settle. It allows you to see clearly. See what truly mattered. See what was worth your energy. And most importantly, see yourself. Because in the end, the people who find peace are not the ones who are never abandoned. They are the ones who learn never to abandon themselves. So if there is one truth to carry from this silence, let it be this: do not chase what is choosing to leave. Do not erode your own soul, trying to hold onto a shadow. Instead, become the inner citadel. Become the kind of presence that remains steady, whether the world stays or goes. Because your worth was never something another person had the power to give you. And it is something they can never take away. Before you step back into the noise of the world, leave a comment below. What is something you only learned to appreciate after it was gone? I read every reflection. And if this silence brought you clarity, consider joining our circle. Because here, we don't chase attention. We build ourselves. Quietly. Patiently. One lesson at a time.